Students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. In today's video, we are going to discuss about a brief history of the Vietnam War, where the United States was directly involved. So in this video, we are going to discuss in detail what were the causes that led to this war, what were the major events during, before and after the war, and what is the major outcome at the end of the war. So first of all, to give you an introduction about this particular issue, Vietnam War basically was a very prolonged struggle that lasted between Vietnam under the communist government, or we can say under the communist army, and the United States of America on the other side. Basically, the US attempted to prevent the spirit of communism in Vietnam general in particular and the Southeast Asia in the general. Basically, after a very long period of time when in the Vietnam War, when US forces, the ground forces were engaged, gradually leaders of the US, presidents of US started to lose the confidence of the public and especially the support of the public for the war. And then finally finally the war ended. And since the end of war, Vietnam War has become what we can say as a benchmark for what not to do in all future US foreign conflicts. So a very big, large or a heavy lesson has been learned by this war, especially for the US foreign policy. So if you try to understand briefly that how long this war lasted, the war began somewhere in the year of 1959 and finally it ended on 30th of April 1975. That means we can say the war lasted almost 16 years. So before going into detail about the war and the history, first let us try to understand the geography of Vietnam. Now Vietnam is a very small country that is situated in Southeast Asia and it is surrounded by China in the north, has a long sea coast across the South China Sea, and in the west it is surrounded by countries such as Laos and Cambodia. So Vietnam, the capital of Vietnam is Hanoi, which is situated in the northern part of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh, that was also earlier known by the name of Saigon, is another important city of Vietnam, which is also called as the financial center, the financial capital of the Vietnam. Now let us try to understand that before the war began, what was going on in the Vietnam. So if we try to take a brief look in the pre-war period of the Vietnam, till 1940, Vietnam has been a French colony for almost 60 years. And in 1940, this thing changed when, as you know, that World War II had started in 1939 and the imperial forces of Japan wanted to occupy a large area of Asia. They actually attacked Vietnam and Japanese forces invaded Vietnam also from the sea. So in 1940, which till now Vietnam was a French colony, now it is basically has two different foreign powers, and that situation lasted also in year 1941. So a part of Vietnam was occupied by the French power, French colonial government, and the part of Vietnam got occupied by the Japanese invasion forces. It was during this turbulent time Ho Chi Minh, who was very influenced by the communist ideologies, he returned back after years of traveling across the world, and then he began basically to fight against these invasive forces. Thus, in between 1941 to 1945, Ho Chi Minh established a headquarters in one of the caves in the northern part of Vietnam and established an organization which he named as Viet Minh with a sole aim of getting rid of the Vietnam from all the foreign invasive power. Now, to ensure this, Ho Chi Minh actually wanted to have a good relationship, a warm relationship with the United States of America, and thus we can see on the September 2nd, 1945, Viet Minh, the organization that has been established by Ho Chi Minh, it announced to establish an independent Vietnam with a new government, and the new government was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And for years, as we have discussed, Ho Chi Minh tried to court the United States so that US can support him against the French, including he supplied the US with a lot of military intelligence which were very beneficial during the World War II. However, despite this help, despite this approach of Ho Chi Minh, US was fully dedicated to follow their Cold War foreign policy of containment, the policy of containment. And policy of containment was basically aimed to prevent the spread of communism any further from the Soviet influence or Soviet region, Soviet Union. So it is in this regard we have to understand that despite Ho Chi Minh wanted the help of US, also he wanted to support US during World War II, US was not so much willing to help Vietnamese because at that time in United States foreign policy, communism was seen as America's mortal enemy, the biggest threat to the United States of America. And this threat was basically governed by a theory that is called as domino theory. Domino theory basically stated that if any one country in Asia fell to communism, there will be an effect of domino. And as suppose we have a lot of dominoes are there, if you push one domino, what will happen due to this? The entire domino chain will fall down. So China, first of all, Soviet Union, we can say, is the origin point of communism. And then Soviet Union, after Soviet Union, China, that has came under the influence of communism. Then after China, Korea, we know that North Korea came under the influence of in communism. And after Korea, the Chinese and Soviet forces wanted to establish communism also in the Vietnam. And that is why US government felt that if Vietnam fell or became came under the strong grip of communism, other such countries in Southeast Asia such as Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, and even India, which at that point in time was still a British colony, would come under the garb of communism. And as communism is America's mortal enemy, any shaking of hand with a person who is very heavily influenced by communist ideology is something which we can say is a very big no for the US foreign policy. Thus, to help prevent Vietnam from becoming a communist country, US decided actually to help France to defeat the Ho Chi Minh and his revolutionaries by sending the French military aid in 1950. So Ho Chi Minh, while he wanted to have help of US in driving French out, US actually went on the other side and they helped French in ensuring that Ho Chi Minh do not win or do not establish the communist government in Vietnam. So this was the situation that were going on. However, situation changed drastically in year 1954 when the French were defeated drastically or very decisively at a place called as Dien Bien Phu, which is situated in the central part of Vietnam. As this decisive defeat of French, now French understood that there's no other way but they have to sooner or later leave the country. They decided to call a conference in the Geneva, that is in the Switzerland. So Geneva conference was initiated, and after the end of Geneva conference, Geneva Accord, that was document that was signed. As per Geneva Accord, a ceasefire for the peaceful withdrawal of French forces were agreed upon, and also it was decided that the Vietnam will be divided temporarily along the 17th parallel. 17th parallel, if you try to understand, is a line that is passing across the 70-degree north latitude, and it divides the Vietnam into two parts, North Vietnam and the South Vietnam, as we can see. So the red part is North Vietnam, that was largely under the influence of communist government because the Ho Chi Minh, he has established his headquarters in northern Vietnam, and southern Vietnam was largely under the influence of French colonial powers and also American forces later on. The most important outcome of the Geneva Accord or agreement upon in the Geneva Accord was that after some time, when the French forces have withdrawn, a general democratic election will be held in year 1956 that would reunite the country. The temporary division that has been done is not going to be lasting for a long period of time. It is just merely for 2 years period. And after this, the country will be reunited under a single government after the democratic elections. However, US was very much worried about this, and they believe that if they agree to the election, what will happen, since a lot of people supported communism and communist ideology, they will actually help the communists win and Ho Chi Minh will emerge as a leader. And that is why, with the help from United States, the South Vietnam, which was still not fully under the influence of communism, carried out election only in the South Vietnam rather than the country-wide elections. And in this particular election, a leader called as Ngo Dien Diem, he actually came, or basically he was winner, and he became the president of the Vietnam. Basically, he was controlling the South Vietnam area. However, after a few months of his rule, he alienated so many South Vietnamese that a lot of communist sympathizers in South Vietnam, they actually wanted to remove him. They actually wanted to have a kind of coup-like situation, and thus they established National Liberation Front, which also popularly is called as Viet Cong in 1960. And the Viet Cong then recruited a lot of people who were basically believer as well as sympathizer of communist ideology, and also those people who were against Ngo Dien Diem. And thus, using guerrilla warfare techniques, they started a war against the South Vietnamese government. And in the further development, coup happened. Ngo Dien Diem was killed, and even US helped in this coup because US was also very much what I can say trouble with the development that was and with the decision that was taken by Ngo Dien Diem. Then, as this progression happened, as US felt that now South Vietnam can also actually come under the influence of communism, and as the conflict, the fighting between Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese continued, US finally decided to send advisors to the South Vietnam. At this point in time, US still has not sent its ground assault forces. But this soon changed when two incidents happened in very quick succession. First of all, in year 1964, we have incident that is called as Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the Viet Cong fired directly upon the naval ships of United States Navy. And second, as a result of this incident, now the entire US government, including the Congress, the the president, and all the party members, both from the Republican Party as well as Democratic Party, they passed a resolution that is called as Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And taking powers from this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the then president of USA, Lyndon B. Johnson, he used authority to order the first US ground troops to Vietnam in the month of March 1965. Thus, what we can say that now, since now US was indirectly supporting the South Vietnamese against the communists, and now US government, US military is now directly involved in the warfare. However, the problem was that US sent its force without specifying any particular goal for the American soldiers, and that proved to be very difficult in the longer period of time. US troops, they were just asked to bolster the South Vietnamese defenses at least until South Vietnam could take over the entire Vietnam and could establish a government there. However, US forces soon found themselves to be in stalemate with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and we can say between year 1965 to 1969, US basically was involved in a limited war with Vietnam. Though there were regular aerial bombings were done in the north, President Johnson did not want the fighting to be limited to South. President Johnson wanted the fighting to be limited to South Vietnam. He did not wanted the American troops, American forces to go into the territory of North Vietnam. And this was very difficult scenario, because by limiting the fighting parameters, US forces were not able to conduct a serious offensive ground assault operation in the north to attack the communists directly, or they will also not able to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you look at this map here, Ho Chi Minh Trail basically refer to the supply route, the logistic route that actually used to supply the Viet Cong in the South Vietnam from the North Vietnam. So basically, South Vietnamese communists and the North Vietnamese communists have a kind of undisrupted supply route, and that proved very costly for the American forces, because a lot of these American soldiers died in vain, and it is mainly because of the limited role they were given by the US president. So further, as the war progressed more and more, the war took a nature of what we can call it as a jungle warfare. Jungle warfare because a large part of area of Vietnam was covered by forest, and Viet Cong, since they were very well aware with the terrain, local terrain, they would attack, they would carry out ambushes against the US forces, they will set up booby traps to trap these US forces, and also they will be able to escape through a complex network of underground tunnels, as you can see from here. And the upper part of tunnel was very narrow, and this was basically covered with grasses, forest, trees, we can say, sometimes woods. So the forces, US forces, do not understand that where the tunnel goes, where the tunnel ends, where the tunnel starts, and thus after carrying out ambushes, attack operations, Viet Cong soldiers were easily able to go inside and hide without coming in contact with the US forces. It is during this time when the US forces realized that in such dense forest, without having a proper knowledge of the local terrain, it would be very difficult to fight with the Viet Cong soldiers. They started to use in large amount what is called as Agent Orange or napalm bomb. Between 1961 to 1971, it is believed that US military has sprayed over 20 million gallons of Agent Orange, which is basically a carcinogen agent, and it was sprayed over 4.5 million acres of Vietnam. The main reason behind use of this Agent Orange was to, when you spread over this forest area or in the dense vegetation area, the entire forest wither away and the entire forest will basically disappear, and thus grasslands and basically we can say the flat lands will open up, and it will be easier for US forces to carry out operation and also to see the enemies at much more farther distance. So however, the effect of Agent Orange was not limited only to the cleaning of forest. Effect was seen even for a later time because of the carcinogenic nature of Agent Orange. It has polluted the waterways, soil, air, caused mass devastation, and also caused a lot of disabilities and deformities among the children that were born in this area. Thus, next important development happened, which is called as My Lai massacre. Actually, in the March month of 1968, it is said that US soldiers tortured and murdered almost 500 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, including men, women, children, and even infants. This was because of a large scale discontentment among the US troops because they're not able to make any significant, what you can say, significant breakthrough in the war. And also, it was very difficult for them to identify that who is communist sympathizer, who is actually Viet Cong member, and who are the innocent villagers who are just living their life. So, My Lai massacre is believed to be one of the most infamous incident that has happened during the Vietnam War period. Now, after this, two major turning points has happened. The first is what we call as Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive. Tet is an annual. It is basically New Year celebration that happens in the Vietnam. This happened in January 30, 1968, when the Viet Cong, along with the help from the North Vietnamese soldier, they launched a coordinated assault across about 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. If you look at this map here, you can clearly see that what are the cities that were being targeted in the Tet Offensive. You can see all the major cities right from north to south were being targeted during the Tet Offensive. However, US forces and South Vietnamese were able to repel the assaults. However, this offensive proved to the US government and US military overall that enemy, which they consider the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the enemy were much more stronger and better organized than they earlier believed. It was a turning point in the war because it was after Tet Offensive, President Johnson was faced now with an unhappy American public and the bad news because a lot of soldiers were dying in Vietnam, and also many military leaders in Vietnam also they were giving him continuously bad news because they are not able to make any significant breakthrough. So thus he decided to no longer escalate the war further. And also prior to this, actually there is a lot of activists, which we call a civil right movement, has begun in America when the news, the pictures started to come from Vietnam, and especially after the My Lai massacre and the use of Agent Orange, large section of American people, especially we talk about the youngsters who are going to college, universities, they basically turned against the war. They were very, very angry about the war because this time human rights, the issues about the human rights, talk about human rights, all this began. And thus, President Johnson decided that he will not escalate the war any further. However, just in the next year in 1969, there was change in the guard at the US president, change of the guard in, we can say, in US government, when Richard Nixon became the new US president, and he had his own plan to end the US involvement in Vietnam. His plan is what he referred as Vietnamization, which basically ensured that during his term, he will make sure that US troops are removed from Vietnam and the fighting is handed back to the South Vietnamese. And thus, to ensure that his plan is going on, he began withdrawal of US troops from the July month of 1969. And at the same time, to ensure that the peace and the work toward peace also goes on, new peace talk was initiated on the 25th of January 1969 in the Paris. And thus, after 4 years of intensive struggle, both a struggle in what you can say between militaries and also the lot of attempts that were made at having a peace formula, the peace talks in Paris finally succeeded in producing what we call as a ceasefire agreement. Thus, last US troops left Vietnam on March 29, 1973, and when they left, they actually knew that they have left behind a very, very weak South Vietnam who would not be able to withstand another major communist North Vietnam attack. And that is what exactly happened. In the early period of 1975, North Vietnam made another big push towards South, which toppled the South Vietnamese government. And as a result of this military onslaught, South Vietnam, basically, the government officially surrendered to Communist North Vietnam on the 30th of April 1975, following which, on the 2nd July 1976, Vietnam was reunited as a single country under the communist government and was given the name of Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh being the president of the Vietnam. The role of Ho Chi Minh is still highlighted and is considered as the most notable figure in the history of Vietnam. And this you can see from the picture here, where you have a large statue of Ho Chi Minh that has been erected in the front of what is called as Reunion Palace. Reunion Palace because this was the palace where the reunification of North and South Vietnam has happened. So that is all about the short history of Vietnam War and history of Vietnam. I hope you like the video. If you like the video, please hit the like button, share it with your aspirants, and subscribe to our channel for more such content. Thank you very much.